The day my husband took everything from me in the divorce, he believed he had destroyed me forever, and I believed my life was over. But neither of us knew that this was only the beginning of his punishment. My name is Emily, and for most of my life, I believed that love was supposed to protect you, marriage was supposed to shelter you, and the person you trusted most in the world would never become the one who hurt you the deepest. I was wrong about all of that, but it took me many painful years, a courtroom full of strangers, and the complete loss of everything I owned to finally understand how wrong I had been. When I first married Michael, I truly believed I had chosen a good man. He was ambitious, confident, and very skilled at making promises sound like guarantees. He spoke about loyalty as if it were part of his nature, about family as if it were his highest value, and about our future as if nothing in the world could ever touch it. I was young enough and in love enough to believe that words were the same thing as truth. In the early years of our marriage, our life looked perfect from the outside. We bought a modest house, built careful routines, hosted dinners with friends, and spoke about children as if they were a certainty, waiting patiently for the right time. Michael worked long hours, and I supported him without complaint, believing that every sacrifice we made together was an investment in a future we would one day share peacefully. I left my own career behind when he asked me to. He told me it would be better if one of us focused on the home, that stability mattered more than independence, and that I could always return to work later. At the time, it sounded reasonable. I trusted him enough to place my entire financial future in his hands without asking for anything in return. For years, I managed our home, our schedules, our social life, and our savings with quiet dedication, believing that partnership meant giving without keeping score. Slowly, without realizing it, I allowed my name to disappear from everything that mattered. The house was in his name. The accounts were in his name. The investments were in his name. Even the small savings I had brought into the marriage were eventually folded into plans I did not fully understand. I did not see the danger in that until it was far too late. The first sign that something in my marriage was breaking came quietly. Michael became distant in ways that were easy to excuse at first. He worked later than usual. He took more business trips. He answered fewer questions and offered fewer details. When I asked if something was wrong, he told me I was imagining things, that stress made me sensitive, and that I should be grateful for everything we had. I wanted to believe him, because believing him was easier than accepting that my life might be built on something unstable. By the time I realized he was no longer faithful to me, the affair had already become part of his daily life. I found the messages by accident, hidden carelessly on a phone he thought I would never check. They were not romantic. They were not poetic. They were practical, casual, and cruel in their normality, discussing meetings, plans, and a future that did not include me. When I confronted him, he did not deny it. He did not apologize. He did not even pretend to be ashamed. He simply told me that he was unhappy, that people changed, and that I should have seen it coming. Within months, he moved out. Within weeks after that, he filed for divorce. I still remember the first meeting with his lawyer, sitting in a small office while documents were placed in front of me that listed everything I thought belonged to both of us, now labeled carefully as his. The house I had managed for years. The savings I had helped build. The retirement accounts I had never questioned. Every asset that represented our life together was written under his name with legal certainty. My own lawyer tried to explain my options, but the truth was simple and devastating. I had given up my career. I had placed my trust in him. I had signed documents without understanding their consequences. And now, legally, I owned almost nothing. Michael did not fight gently. He demanded the house. He demanded the majority of the savings. He demanded investments I had helped plan. He even demanded personal items that had belonged to my family before the marriage, simply because they were stored in the house. In court, he sat confidently beside his lawyer, dressed perfectly, calm and prepared, while I struggled to understand how the man I had built my life around could look at me as if I were now simply an obstacle in his way. When the judge finally made the decision, the words felt unreal. Michael was awarded almost everything. The house, the majority of the money, the long-term investments, even control over assets I had assumed would naturally be shared. When it was over, he stood up, turned toward me and smiled. Not a polite smile, not a nervous smile. A satisfied smile. The smile of a man who believed he had won. That moment stayed with me longer than any legal document ever could. Because in that single expression, I understood something that took years to fully accept. He did not simply want to leave me. He wanted to defeat me. I left the courthouse that day with a small suitcase, a modest settlement that would barely support me for a year, and a life that no longer resembled anything I had planned. I moved into a small rented apartment far from the neighborhood I had called home, took a job far below my previous education level, and learned very quickly what it meant to survive without comfort, without security, and without the protection of anyone else. The first year after the divorce was the hardest period of my life. I learned how to count every expense. I learned how to live in a space small enough that silence felt loud. I learned how to sleep alone in a bed that felt too big and too empty at the same time. I learned how to rebuild dignity slowly, one decision at a time. What I did not know was that while my life was breaking down and rebuilding quietly, Michael's life was beginning a very different kind of journey. He remarried quickly, a younger woman, a woman impressed by his success, his confidence, and his apparent victory. He bought a larger house. He changed his car. He spoke proudly about his new life to anyone who would listen. From the outside, it looked like he had won completely. But what I did not yet understand was that in taking everything from me, he had also taken something invisible that would cost him far more than any house or account ever could. He had taken responsibility. He had taken honesty. He had taken the habit of caring about consequences. And in doing so, he had begun a pattern that would slowly destroy everything he touched. At the time, I did not know any of this. All I knew was that I had to survive. So I worked. I studied again. I rebuilt my career slowly. I saved carefully. I learned independence in a way I had never been forced to before. And most importantly, I learned how to live without expecting fairness from people who did not possess it. Years passed. My life stabilized. Not wealthy. Not comfortable, but honest. Meanwhile, Michael's life began to show small cracks that I would only hear about through distant acquaintances, business decisions that went wrong, partnerships that failed, debts that grew quietly, a marriage that did not bring him peace, a reputation that slowly changed. At first, I did not pay attention. I was too busy building my own life to care about the ruins of his. But fate has a way of bringing people back into your life when you least expect it. One evening, many years after the divorce, I received a message from a number I did not recognize. It was from Michael. And what he wrote would become the beginning of the final chapter of our story. When I received that first message from Michael after so many years of silence, I did not answer it immediately. I stared at the phone for a long time, trying to understand why a man who had erased me from his life so completely now felt the need to remind me that he still existed. The message itself was simple, almost polite, but beneath its surface I sensed something unfamiliar, something uncertain, something that did not belong to the confident man who had once smiled at me in a courtroom. By that time, my life had become something steady and predictable, built not on ambition but on discipline, patience, and the quiet satisfaction of independence. I had rebuilt my career slowly, starting with small positions that barely paid my rent and working my way upward through years of effort that no one applauded and no one noticed. I had learned to manage my finances carefully, to save without dreaming recklessly, and to find dignity in stability rather than success. I lived in a modest apartment in a quiet neighborhood, close enough to my work that I could walk when I wanted to clear my mind. My life was not impressive, but it was mine, and for the first time in many years, I did not feel afraid of the future. Michael, on the other hand, had built a life that looked impressive but rested on something far less stable. Through mutual acquaintances, distant friends, and occasional rumors that reached me unintentionally, I began to understand that his second marriage had not given him the peace he had expected. The woman he married admired his wealth and confidence, but she did not understand his habits, his need for control, or his inability to accept responsibility when things went wrong. Their relationship, like ours before it, was built on promises and appearances rather than patience and honesty. Michael had continued the same pattern that had defined our marriage, making large decisions without caution, investing aggressively, borrowing against future earnings that had not yet arrived, and trusting his own judgment more than any advice he was given. For a time, this approach seemed to work. His business expanded. His income increased. His lifestyle grew more extravagant. But what grows too quickly often grows without roots. The first serious problem appeared in one of his major investments, a project he had entered confidently and without proper research. When the market shifted unexpectedly, the project collapsed, leaving him responsible for debts far larger than he had anticipated. Instead of slowing down and correcting his course, he responded the only way he knew how, by taking greater risks, in the hope of recovering his losses quickly. That decision began a chain of events that would define the next phase of his life. He borrowed more. He invested more, aggressively. He ignored warning signs. He dismissed cautious advisors. And slowly, quietly, his financial stability began to erode. At the same time, his second marriage began to suffer under the weight of his stress and secrecy. The man who had once charmed me with patience now revealed himself as impatient, irritable, and increasingly distant. He spent long hours away from home, not always working, sometimes simply avoiding the reality that waited for him there. Arguments became frequent. Trust weakened. Resentment grew. What he had once called a new beginning became another source of pressure he could no longer manage. Years passed in this pattern, with his life outwardly successful and inwardly deteriorating, while mine continued on a quieter, steadier path. I earned promotion slowly, built a small but reliable savings, and learned to value peace over excitement, consistency over ambition, and solitude over chaos. By the time Michael sent me that message, I was a woman very different from the one who had left the courthouse years earlier, with a suitcase and a broken future. The message he sent was not dramatic. It did not ask for forgiveness. It did not explain his reasons. It simply said that he hoped I was well, that he had been thinking about the past, and that he wondered if I would be willing to meet him for coffee one day. I did not answer immediately because I did not know what I felt. I did not feel anger. I did not feel longing. I felt curiosity. Not about him, but about fate. What had brought him back to me now? Why after so many years? Why after so much silence? Days passed before I finally replied, agreeing to meet him briefly, not out of hope, but out of a quiet desire to understand the shape of the life he had built after destroying mine. When I saw him again for the first time in years, I barely recognized him. He was still well-dressed, still confident in posture, still careful with his appearance, but something in his face had changed. The ease was gone. The certainty was weaker. The smile he offered did not reach his eyes. As we spoke about ordinary things, about work, about time, about neutral memories, I realized that he was measuring me carefully, as if trying to understand how much I had recovered, how strong I had become, and how much power he still held over me. He spoke proudly of his career, but not in detail. He mentioned his marriage, but not warmly. He asked about my life, and for the first time, I noticed that he listened carefully to my answers. I did not tell him everything. I did not tell him about the nights I had cried alone. I did not tell him about the years of fear. I did not tell him about the sacrifices. I told him only what mattered. That I was stable, that I was independent, that I was content. When we parted that day, I sensed that the meeting had not given him what he wanted, because what he wanted was not conversation. What he wanted was reassurance, and he did not find it. After that meeting, his messages became more frequent. At first, they were casual. Then, thoughtful. Then strangely reflective. He spoke about regrets, about mistakes, about decisions he wished he could change. But still, he did not say what truly mattered. He did not apologize. He did not admit wrongdoing. He did not acknowledge what he had taken from me. And I did not offer him the comfort he seemed to seek. Meanwhile, his life continued to unravel. His second marriage ended quietly and without celebration. His debts increased, his reputation suffered, business partners withdrew. Banks became cautious. Opportunities disappeared. What he had built with arrogance began to collapse under the weight of reality. And slowly, without announcing it, the man who had once taken everything from me began to lose everything himself. At first, I heard about the loss of his house. Then about the sale of his business. Then about lawsuits. Then about debts he could no longer hide. Each piece of news arrived without emotion, without satisfaction, without triumph. Because by then, I did not want revenge. I wanted understanding. I wanted to see whether the man who had destroyed my life could finally understand the cost of what he had done. One evening, many months after our first meeting, he sent me another message. This one was different. This one was longer. This one was honest. He told me that he was in serious trouble, that he had lost almost everything, that he was struggling financially, that he had no one he trusted enough to speak to, that he was afraid, and that he needed help. When I finished reading it, I realized that the moment I had unknowingly been waiting for had finally arrived. Because now, for the first time in many years, the balance between us had changed. He was no longer the man who held all the power, and I was no longer the woman who had nothing. But I still did not know what I was going to do. Because sometimes the hardest decision is not whether to forgive. It is whether to let someone face the consequences they have spent a lifetime avoiding, and that decision would define everything that came next. When Michael sent that message asking for help, I did not answer him for several days. Not because I did not know what to say, but because I understood that whatever I chose to say would change the final shape of our story. For many years, I had lived without thinking about him, without measuring my life against his, and without wishing for justice or revenge. Now, suddenly, the past had returned to stand quietly at my door, asking me to decide how it would end. During those days of silence, I thought deeply about the woman I had been when he left me with nothing and the woman I had become since then. I remembered the fear of losing my home, the humiliation of starting again from nothing, the loneliness of rebuilding a life that no longer had a partner to lean on. I remembered how powerless I had felt, how invisible, how easily he had walked away from responsibility. And I compared that to the life I had now. Not wealthy. Not glamorous. But honest. Stable. Independent. Built with my own hands. Michael, on the other hand, now stood where I had once stood, uncertain, frightened, and slowly realizing that the world no longer protected him. When I finally agreed to meet him again, I did so without expectation, without hope, and without anger. I wanted only to understand how completely his life had changed and whether he had learned anything from the years that had passed. This time, he did not try to impress me. He did not speak proudly. He did not hide his exhaustion. The man who sat across from me looked older than his age, thinner than before, and far less certain of himself. His success had disappeared quietly, leaving behind debts, legal troubles, and a future that no longer followed any clear path. He spoke about losing his business. He spoke about creditors. He spoke about the collapse of his second marriage. He spoke about friends who had disappeared. He spoke about nights spent awake, calculating numbers that no longer made sense. He spoke about fear. Not the fear of loneliness. Not the fear of regret. The fear of failure. For the first time in many years, he did not describe himself as a victim of bad luck or unfair circumstances. He admitted that his own decisions had led him here, that his pride had blinded him, and that his belief in his own intelligence had prevented him from listening when he should have. Still, there was something missing. He spoke about loss. He spoke about money. He spoke about status. But he did not speak about me. Not about what he had done to me. Not about what he had taken. Not about the years he had destroyed. And I understood something important in that moment. His suffering was real, but his understanding was incomplete. Over the next months, our contact became more frequent. He asked for advice about finances, about work, about rebuilding his life. He asked whether I knew anyone who could help him find employment. He asked whether I believed he could recover. Slowly, carefully, I began to see the shape of his request. He did not want forgiveness. He wanted support. He did not want reconciliation. He wanted rescue. And here, for the first time, I faced a question I had never expected to face. What do you owe someone who once took everything from you? I was no longer legally bound to him. I was no longer emotionally attached to him. I owed him nothing. And yet, I also knew that the woman I had become was not built on cruelty or revenge. So, I offered him limited help. Not money. Not shelter. Not protection. But guidance. I connected him with a financial counselor. I helped him prepare a realistic plan to reduce his debts. I advised him to seek employment far below the level he once considered acceptable. I showed him how to rebuild slowly, the same way I had rebuilt. At first, he followed my advice. He accepted smaller work. He sold what remained of his assets. He began repaying debts. For a brief period, it seemed that he might truly change. But change is not something that happens because of crisis alone. It happens only when pride is finally replaced by humility. And Michael still struggled with humility. As months passed, I began to notice the old patterns returning. He looked for shortcuts. He searched for quick opportunities. He believed he could recover everything fast if he found the right deal. He grew impatient with slow progress. He resented the life he now lived. And slowly, against my advice, he began taking risks again. One investment, then another, then a loan, then another promise of easy recovery. I warned him. I explained. I urged caution. But the same man who had once ignored warnings in marriage now ignored warnings in ruin. When the next failure came, it was devastating. The small stability he had rebuilt disappeared. Almost overnight, the debts returned. The creditors grew aggressive. Legal pressure increased. In this time, there was no second marriage, no large house, no successful business left. To protect him, he came to me again, not for advice, but for help. This time, he asked for something he had never asked before. He asked for money. Not a small amount. A large amount. Enough to protect him from bankruptcy. Enough to delay the consequences of his choices. Enough to save him. I listened carefully, and for the first time in many years, I felt something close to power. Not the power to hurt him, not the power to humiliate him, the power to decide his fate. Because now, the situation was reversed. He was asking the woman he had once destroyed to protect him from the consequences of his life. And I understood something in that moment that took my breath away. If I gave him this money, I would be repeating the same mistake I had made in my marriage. I would be protecting him from responsibility. I would be enabling his patterns. I would be sacrificing my own security for a man who had never protected mine. But if I refused, he would lose almost everything that still remained. His career would end. His reputation would collapse. His future would narrow to something far smaller than he had ever imagined. I did not answer him that day. I told him I needed time. And for many nights after that, I lay awake thinking about justice, mercy, revenge, and the strange ways in which life offers us second chances to make better decisions than we made the first time. Because now, I finally understood. The punishment he faced was not something I had to create. It was something he had created himself. And the final question was not what he deserved. The final question was what kind of person I wanted to be. And that decision would define the final chapter of our story. The years I spent rebuilding my life after Michael took everything from me in the divorce were years of quiet, relentless transformation. I had learned the meaning of patience, of discipline, of fortitude. I had learned to live without expectation, to save without applause, to grow without recognition, and to find dignity in solitude. Every morning I woke, I reminded myself that the past could not be changed, that the man who had destroyed my life could not erase the woman I had become. And yet, the memory of that courtroom, the sight of his smile and the weight of all that I had lost remained with me, a quiet echo I could not ignore. When Michael sent me his first message asking for help, I recognized it immediately as the opening of a door I had not known I was waiting for. At first, I did not answer, because answering would require a decision, and decisions carried consequences. I spent long hours thinking about what I had endured, about the fear I had felt, about the sleepless nights when I questioned whether I would survive alone. I remembered the months of navigating life with barely enough money to cover rent, the jobs I had taken that paid far less than my education justified, the endless calculations of expenses, and the constant anxiety of rebuilding while the world seemed determined to punish me further. All of that had led to this moment where the man who had once been all-powerful in my life was now, quietly, seeking something from me. And I realized as I held the phone in my hands and stared at his words, that the power in our lives had shifted. He was no longer the man who could walk into a room and command respect. He was no longer the man who could smile in court while taking everything. He was no longer the man who believed he could manipulate circumstances without consequence. The arrogance that had once defined him was gone, replaced by something unfamiliar: fear. For the first time, I recognized the immense weight of responsibility that comes with taking without consideration the invisible debts one owes to morality, to truth, to humanity. And in that recognition, I knew the final chapter of our story had begun. When I met him for the first time in years, the change in him was impossible to ignore. He was thinner, more cautious in his movements, and carried a weight in his eyes that had not been there before. His face, once so confident, so assured, now reflected the cracks of repeated failures and relentless pressure. He no longer exuded the ease of a man who believed the world would bend to his will. He looked at me as though measuring the difference between the woman he had destroyed and the woman he now faced, and I understood that in that moment, he realized he was no longer in control. As we spoke, I noted how carefully he chose his words, how tentative his questions were, how desperately he searched for approval or guidance. He asked about my life, my work, my stability, as though these things were still his to judge, as though he still expected validation from the woman he had once believed powerless. I did not provide it. I answered only enough to satisfy politeness. I did not allow my empathy to cloud judgment. I did not allow nostalgia to weaken my resolve. I had learned that kindness must be tempered with wisdom, and that protection of the self was never negotiable. After that meeting, Michael's messages became more frequent. They were no longer casual. They were urgent. He asked about financial advice, sought insight into investments, requested suggestions for professional opportunities, and occasionally admitted his failures with a vulnerability he had never shown before. I could see, even in the written word, the weight of years spent avoiding consequences finally pressing down upon him. The life he had built through shortcuts, arrogance, and disregard for others was crumbling, and he could no longer escape its collapse. The facade of success he had constructed was gone, leaving only the reality of hard work, risk, and personal accountability. Over the next months, I watched, sometimes from a distance, sometimes through brief updates he sent, as Michael's world deteriorated piece by piece. His second marriage ended quietly but irrevocably, revealing the fragile foundation upon which it had been built. Investments that seemed promising fell apart when market conditions shifted unexpectedly. Debts he had underestimated multiplied rapidly, and business relationships that had once supported him evaporated under scrutiny. Each failure was accompanied by a growing awareness in him that no one would intervene this time, that his life was truly his responsibility, and that his previous sense of entitlement was no longer valid. Meanwhile, I continued to build my life with patience, care, and precision. My career advanced steadily, not dramatically, but with consistency. I saved diligently, invested prudently, and created a foundation that could withstand unforeseen storms. I learned to derive satisfaction from stability, not extravagance, from accomplishment, not admiration, from resilience, not recognition. Every decision I made was guided by the lessons learned from having been stripped of everything, and the wisdom I had gained became a shield against both past and future harm. I understood now that true victory was not in regaining what had been lost, but in creating something permanent, something unshakable, something that no one else could take from me. Months passed, and Michael's situation worsened, one by one. The businesses he had once relied upon folded under financial pressure. Loans went unpaid. Creditors became relentless. and his reputation in professional circles declined until opportunities became scarce. The life he had constructed with pride and arrogance was reduced to fragments, and the man who had once smiled triumphantly in court was now forced to reckon with the reality of what happens when choices are ignored, warnings dismissed, and consequences deferred. He was learning painfully that success without integrity is always temporary. Through all of this, he continued to reach out to me. At first it was for advice, for guidance, for practical solutions. Then, increasingly, it was for emotional support, a reassurance that he had not fully understood existed only in the years he had taken from me. He admitted fear, regret, and exhaustion. He admitted that he no longer knew whom to trust, and that the isolation he experienced was unlike anything he had ever felt. And in these admissions, I observed the profound transformation that occurs when power is lost and life's illusions are stripped away. Finally, he asked me for something he had never before dared to request: financial assistance. A large sum, enough to stave off bankruptcy, enough to protect him from the consequences of years of reckless behavior. When I read his request, I felt an awareness unlike anything I had known. This was not a request made in desperation alone. It was a test of the woman he had once destroyed, a test of the life I had rebuilt, a test of whether I would repeat the mistakes of my youth by protecting someone who had proven incapable of protecting others. I did not answer immediately. I spent nights reflecting on every decision I had made, every sacrifice I had endured, and every lesson learned through loss. I thought about the long months when my only security had been the steady rhythm of my own efforts. I remembered the emptiness of my apartment, the quiet of nights spent alone, and the small victories of building a life from nothing. And I knew without hesitation that giving him the money he requested would undo years of hard-earned independence and teach him nothing, because consequences must be faced in full to be truly understood. When I finally met him to deliver my decision, I looked at him quietly. He was tired, humbled, and aware that his life had been reshaped by the very choices he had made. He no longer commanded the room. He no longer expected admiration. He no longer smiled with arrogance. And I understood, in that moment, that true justice does not require cruelty. It requires clarity. It requires understanding. It requires allowing life to teach its lessons in full measure. I told him that I could not provide the financial assistance he sought, not out of malice but out of necessity for both of us. I told him that survival requires accountability. I told him that he must face the consequences of the life he had chosen, and that only through struggle, humility, and effort could he truly learn the lessons he had previously ignored. I did not chastise. I did not boast. I simply stated the truth as it existed between us. And in that truth, both of us recognized a new balance, a shift of power no longer dictated by courtrooms, assets, or appearances. The collapse of Michael's life continued. Bankruptcy became final. Assets were liquidated. Employment was limited to positions far below his education and experience. Friends who had once admired him quietly disappeared. His new life, like his previous one, was reduced to the essentials of survival. And yet, in all of this, there was one thing he gained: awareness. The understanding that every choice carries weight, that every action has consequences, and that no person can permanently escape the cost of arrogance. Meanwhile, my life flourished in ways that were quiet but profound. I moved into a stable apartment in a peaceful neighborhood, advanced steadily in my career, nurtured friendships built on honesty and respect, and built a financial foundation that no one could undermine. I learned that true wealth is not the accumulation of money, but the accumulation of resilience, integrity, and self-respect. I understood that my victory had never been about making Michael fail. It had always been about ensuring that I succeeded, that I survived, and that I grew stronger than the circumstances designed to break me. Years later, we met one final time. He was older, quieter, humbled by experience, and fully aware of the magnitude of his losses. I was older, wiser, and fully aware of the magnitude of my survival. There were no apologies, no accusations, no bitterness. only recognition, only understanding, only the quiet acknowledgement that life had balanced itself in a way neither of us could have predicted in our youth. He had taken everything from me, and in return, life had taken everything from him, teaching both of us the ultimate lesson. Power without responsibility is always fleeting, and survival, integrity, and wisdom endure far beyond fleeting triumphs. I had survived, rebuilt, and grown. He had fallen, learned, and understood. And in that quiet realization, the story finally concluded. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who may be going through betrayal, heartbreak, or loss. Subscribe to this channel for more emotional true stories of love, loss, resilience, and triumph, and leave a comment telling us what you would have done in Emily's place. Because sometimes the hardest lessons are learned by listening to each other. Your story might inspire someone. Today, never underestimate the power of sharing your journey.